I've struggled with writer's block. Surely those authors in the previous screen have struggled with writer's block. But what exactly is writer's block? Let's understand it. Hey authors, how's it going? How's the book coming along? We've got a really interesting video today. It's a bit of a long video as well. At the end of it, I think you'll be very satisfied because I'm going to be using research and evidences from those research to make my point, which is writer's block. It is a thing, it is something which can be very debilitating. Of course, in the next couple of videos, maybe in the next video, I will talk about what you can do to help yourself overcome writer's block and maybe just put it aside so that you can get on with your writing. But for now, let's just understand what writer's block is. In the 1940s, in the peak of Freudian era, a psychiatrist named Edmund Bergler coined the term writer's block. Now, he didn't exactly make a definition for writer's block, but he sure did have a lot to say about what caused writer's block. And I'm not going to show this on my video because in case I get monetized, I don't want something striking out my monetization, but you can always do a Google search. I'll maybe leave a link in the description for you to learn what Edmund Bergler said about writer's block. It's very bizarre, I should warn you right off the bat. In his paper, Understanding Writer's Block, a therapist's guide to diagnosis and treatment, Brinkerhoff suggested that writer's block, or the phenomenon called writer's block, should be better described by the term creative inhibition. And by the end of this video, I'm going to help you understand exactly why that is the most apt way to describe the phenomenon that is writer's block. Because to understand whether or not to call this phenomenon where a writer can't write, can't come up with a story effectively, you need to understand a bit of the brain and how the brain works. You might already know this, but the brain has two halves: the right hemisphere, which is my right hand, and the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere and the left hemisphere are divided dorsoventrally from the front to the back. The right hemisphere is the more creative half of the brain, and the left hemisphere deals a lot with logic, analytics, and as well as some maths. So when we do creative writing, when you and I write a story, for example, we actually end up using both halves of the brain. Writing a novel, writing anything, for example, writing fiction, just writing in general, creative writing is one such art which uses both halves of the brain. It uses the right half for the imagination, memories, your experiences trigger the right half, specific regions in the right half, and then you gotta make it make sense, so you call upon the left half. That way you use both halves. To truly understand what exactly is happening, researchers have a tool essentially to figure out tiny changes in blood pressure and tiny changes in blood flow in the capillaries of your brain to understand what's happening and which regions are activated or deactivated. So this tool is called an fMRI, or a functional magnetic resonance imaging. So think of it this way: it's an MRI machine, but this also understands the functioning of the brain. Using this tool, a couple of researchers in Germany, I believe, were able to bring together a bunch of writers, expert writers. They gave them 30 words to come up with a story. And while they were doing this, they were inside the MRI machine. And what the machine observed is truly fascinating. Among all the regions of the brain which lit up in the fMRI, the frontal lobe lit up, the hippocampus lit up, the Wernicke's area lit up, the Broca's area lit up, everything lit up. But there was one specific part of the brain which is much closer to the base, towards, let's say, the brainstem. So there was this one area which lit up, which is the caudate nucleus. Why is this interesting? Because the caudate nucleus is one such part of the brain which helps in maintaining an orchestra. So you know how you have the conductor in the orchestra, and he's able to conduct the various instruments and the various people playing those instruments to create a rhythm which you really like, a harmony, beautiful harmonies. So the chordate nucleus is just that. And guess what? It also helps in other activities that you do on a daily basis, like driving, for example. The chordate nucleus links up and orchestrates your vision, your hearing, many senses you use when you're driving, and the chordate nucleus helps orchestrate that. If you're a painter, it helps orchestrate textures, your vision, your sensory tactile senses, all of that. Even if you're a musician, like I said, the chordate nucleus is all behind those. What this region of the brain does is part of why there's a controversy around writer's block. A lot of people, a lot of famous, reputed authors have completely dismissed its existence. They even go as far as to discredit anyone else who experienced something like this. Some of them even said it is American in its origin and that only Americans feel something like this. In a lot of my research, I couldn't find any evidence that suggested only Americans experienced it, or that only Asians experienced it, or only Africans experienced it. There was no racial or geographical bias. Any writer or anywhere from anywhere of the world could experience writer's block. And I'll also get into why this controversy comes and also maybe break it down a little bit for you. So what do you think? Whom do we believe? Do we just leave it at face value? Leave it that famous reputed authors have said that there is no such thing as writer's block, creative inhibition? Not quite. Remember a while back I said that two regions of the brain were broadly involved in creative writing, like the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, and as well as the frontal lobe and a bunch of other areas. My theory is that there is probably some sort of stress, not with writing, stress in other aspects of your life contributes to this creative inhibition. We will also get into why this is where some of the controversy falls down, some of the claims of those reputed authors falls flat on their faces. Stress, that's like the go-to word today. That's like the go-to reason for anyone to blame underperformance or poor adaptability, whatever. If something doesn't work well, it's stress. Maybe it's worthwhile to understand what kind of stress this is that we're dealing with when it comes to creative inhibition. But before that, let's understand what the brain does when it experiences any kind of stress. In a lot of my research that I've read, the brain is described as a mediator as well as a recipient of stress responses. What that means is the brain is identifying, it is orchestrating a response, and it is also dealing with its own medicine, with its own orchestrated response to an external stress. So it is possible that some of these responses are what causes the inhibition in the first place. But that's something which we can't alter. That's something we can't change about the brain. The hippocampus and the amygdala are limbic structures in the brain which interface with lower vegetative areas such as the hypothalamus, but they also connect and function with higher cortical areas like the prefrontal cortex. A paper published in the Biological Psychiatry Research Journal in January of 2008, the researchers brought in 50 healthy subjects with a mean age of about 26 years of age. During this test, they were asked to go through a challenging set of arithmetic problems. This test contained a couple of feedback loops. First was the machine, the computer on which the test was displayed was constantly giving feedback. But in addition to this, there was also an invigilator after a set of each few questions. The invigilator was asked to judge how well or how poorly the subjects were doing. This simulated a stressful environment. This simulated a stressful social environment as well from the invigilator, and that's a negative feedback loop. At the end of this test, the results were really interesting. What the researchers found was that in the subjects there was a marked decrease in hippocampus activity. That means the hippocampus was largely deactivated. There was no blood flow there, so there was no clear signs of functioning in the hippocampus. However, there was no real change between before the test and after the test in the amygdala activity. There was a possible conflict here because some might say that there was a component of fear. If something like this were happening, I would surely be very scared. But how do you decipher that? How do you separate stress and fear? A couple of animal tests were used, analogs, that means their brain structures and how they perform, and the results from those brain structures are analogs to human brains. That means we can use results from that and infer those with human results. In the animal studies, there was a marked increase in amygdala activity, which means in fear, there is an increase in amygdala activity, which makes sense because the amygdala is helpful to get us through tough situations through instinct. That's where all of the instinct and all of the how to craft response, all of that is in the amygdala, but it's not in the hippocampus. But in this test, there was a decrease in hippocampal activity, which, by the way, I should mention, they don't correlate. If something happens to the hippocampus, something need not always happen with the amygdala. It can happen together, it can be separate of each other. What I'm trying to say is they are exclusive of each other. They don't really connect, they're not correlated, they are not related to each other. What happens to one does not necessarily need to happen to the other. So coming back to the test, one of the inferences was the negative feedback loop given by the invigilator was the reason why the hippocampus was inhibited, which makes sense. A lot of our emotional understanding comes from the hippocampus. In the test, the subjects had their hippocampuses deactivated. Let's get this straight. The hippocampus is deactivated in stress. That's more of where you get some of your creative ideas from. From this test, I can safely say if you're stressed because of a social implication or any kind of social stress, let it be peer pressure or maybe poor performance at your job, negative results in school or college, a pressure like that which has a social component, that's what inhibits your hippocampus. Probably that is why you are not able to write, because the hippocampus, if you remember from the start of the video, I said a hippocampus is an essential part of creative writing. That's where some of your experiences and the adaptations of your experiences and a lot of the creativity comes from the hippocampus. From this research, I think you and me can agree. We have established one fact. The term creative inhibition is a way better description of the phenomenon often called as writer's block. The creative ability is inhibited from an external source. But this leaves us with one area which we have not accounted for: the caudate nuclei. The relation between the caudate nuclei and creative writing is not very understood. From the research that I have read, it is not a linear relationship. Initially, one of the research said that a larger caudate nuclei is helpful. It means more function. That's actually not true. A larger volume of the caudate nuclei does not translate to better capacity and better capability. And in fact, the opposite is also true. A smaller caudate nuclei does not infer less inferior capacity. However, there is a correlation with caudate nuclei and language. That is where in one research paper that I came across said a larger volume of the caudate nucleus was observed in bilingual speakers in comparison to their monolingual counterparts. Let's break it down into simple things. Social stress is the cause of creative inhibition. It causes a lot of impairment for you to be creative because the creative centers of your brain are deactivated. Those areas of the brain are not functioning. However, sometimes the caudate nucleus helps take over, and that's where I think a lot of the controversy lies, because a lot of established and reputed authors have been in the writing for a long time, for at least 10 years. That's what some of the authors that I mentioned were, 10 years, 20 years into their writing fields. So their caudate nucleus is probably very well trained. Even if they did experience creative inhibition, the caudate nucleus was often there to take over and at least get started and make the part of writing very seamless. New authors, fresh entrants, new writers, aspiring writers, don't often have the caudate nucleus to rely on. Again, it's not a very straightforward thing because a more trained caudate nucleus does not always translate to more. I at least didn't find any research or any evidence supporting that. The best way to understand this is that there are always outliers in everything. There are outliers in sports, there are outliers in academics, there are outliers in something as simple as height. To base our experience and base our own emotions and what is happening with us on those outliers, I think we're doing ourselves a big injustice. We should stop that. What I have found from my research and from my thorough look of the whole sphere in neurology is that creative inhibition is a thing. Creative inhibition does affect writers, and it is a problem which should be taken very seriously. So in the next video, or maybe a couple of videos later, I will come back with some tips for you to overcome creative inhibition, how to circumvent it. I think that sums it up for this video. See you guys in the next video.